Okay, so it's week 13. Today's our last class before the final exam. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today trying to build our own API using PHP. So we kind of left off, here was our site as we left it last week. So we integrated a number of different APIs in here. We integrated our little weather widget down here. We implemented on our register page. We implemented Google's reCAPTCHA API, and for Lab 4, most of you did the lab. It was probably pretty quick and painless to add the Facebook. Okay. So what we want to do today is we actually want to build our own little JSON API. So we're still going to use our beers. I'll just log back in. We'll use our beer store data. So what we want to do is we want to build an API that will allow another application to access in a read-only manner. They can't make changes, but they can access the list of beers in our application. Could you think of a kind of a real-world scenario of why we might want to do this? So if we're a beer store and here's our inventory, why might we make an API available? Who might use it?
Well, if you were to get like a corporation or something like that, you put small businesses underneath you, they'll all have individual websites. You need to pull data off the website.
That's a great idea, right? If we make changes, right? If I put something on sale here, or I add a new beer into my inventory, yeah, my sub stores, then I don't have to send them that change. They can always just pull a live list, right? Whatever's in our inventory, if we make that available in an API, then sub businesses of ours could access it. Absolutely. Think of another scenario for a different application.
Could you use this information for like a beer app?
Absolutely. Here, so Omar, let's think about, so here's going to be my beer app, right? This is not a PHP site. This is a completely separate application, formatting's a little wonky, that I've actually built with Node.js, which we'll learn together next year. I'll show you the code in a minute. So yeah, so explain a bit more. How does it work? Why do I want this data coming from the API?
It's up-to-date information, so customers they're curious what your inventory is and what beers you carry, and they need the latest information.
Absolutely. So this could be my app, right? I could when you come into the store, you can go to the Play Store or and you could download the app and it will always have my listings. But it could even be, I could even make it available for someone else. Let's say someone wants to make a beer ratings app, right? So I should be able to see all the current beers in the store, and maybe I can go in and I can write a review and I can give it a 5-star rating. I could list it by categories. So rather than me, if I'm building this app, rather than me needing to get a copy of always how am I going to get the current list of beers and the current pricing at all times, I can just pull it from an API. So this is a totally separate application. And what we're going to see here, so let's say I make a change. Well, let's say I add a new beer here. So I'm going to go in. So in my main database, my main beer store, we'll go in, we'll put in something else. What's the last beer? Anybody have a beer last night? Yeah, no, about 50. Okay. I don't know what 50 is. It's never been expensive.
Yeah.
It's not very good, right? So I've saved that information to my PHP database. So my little application here, this is Node.js. I have no access to the PHP database, but instead I created an API. If I refresh my little app here, it now has 6. So it's pulling that data from my API. If I go ahead and make changes, if I delete something, it's going to get removed. So now my app always has a current source of data. But it's read-only. I can't make changes in my app. I can't add, edit, delete beers. All I can do is view that data. So what we want here is we want to set up something that will look like this, right? We want a JSON object. We want to query our beers table and pull out all of the data and render it back as JSON. So now any application that calls this URL will get that block of JSON, and that application can present the data however they want. But it's always going to be live. It's always going to be real time and up to date. So what we're going to build is this little API. It's pretty simple, really. We just need to get the data from our database, and instead of displaying it on our page in HTML, we're going to use PHP to render it as JSON. And then any other client application can consume our data. So let's take our stuff from last week. Let's take our folder and all of our files. Make a lesson 13 folder. We'll paste it in, and I'll open up this folder in my code editor. I'll change my htaccess so that it points to the right folder. It says lesson 12 for my 404 page. We're not actually going to modify any of the PHP pages today. We're going to build a separate page for our API. So you don't have to copy these, but it's a good idea because at the end of class today, you have our full completed application, including the API. So all the stuff we've done over the course of the entire class will be in this folder. I also, last week, I had one little formatting problem with my weather widget. I think I used a call small 10, which put my little weather widget kind of down here somewhere. I want it off to the right. So the way I changed that is I just changed, if we had here on line 6, I think in my code last week I had a 10 column div. I've made it 8 columns. So it's a little narrower, so the weather widget now floats up to the right. So that'll fix that. So I'm going to upload this to the server just so I have an online version for today. So now I can run my beer store from lesson 13. It works fine. So you should put yours online, then you have this example you can show. Labatt 50, eh? Did you enjoy it?
It was free.
Well, it's always better when it's free. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to need to create a new PHP page for our beers API. I don't want to put it in my root folder. I'm going to make a subdirectory in lesson 13, and I'll call that directory API. So that way, if we write different API functions, we'll create different PHP pages in there. We're only going to do one, but if we wanted other ones, it would go in there. So inside of my folder for today, I'm going to make a new directory, which I will call API. Now I have this little API folder. Whoops, I put it in my uploads folder, which is in the wrong place. It should just go right in the root of today. So here are all my files, and I have an API subfolder, which is empty. And now in here, in my API subfolder, I'm going to make a new PHP file in here, which I will call beers.php. Give it the same name. But the beers page that's in our root, that's our HTML version. The beers page that's in the API folder, that's our JSON version. So my path is lesson 13/API/beers.php. I'm going to take out any HTML in here. This page will only display JSON, right? Because users aren't going to load this page. No one's going to load it in their browser. This page is going to be called by another website, a mobile app, a desktop application, some other application that wants to consume our data. We can throw on a set of PHP tags. Everything on this page will be inside of the PHP tags. There's no HTML whatsoever. We haven't actually built a new PHP page for a few weeks, so we'll do it the way we've done in the past. Let's plan out and comment all of the steps, and then we'll write the code. Most of the code that goes on here is stuff we've already done a million times. There's only one or two new pieces. So what will we need to do? What will we need to do so that this is what the completed page will render when it's called? So what things will we have to do in order to produce this? This is the end product.
Pull our data.
Okay, yep. So what's the first step if we got to pull the data?
I gotta pull some of these files.
Okay. You're right, Chad, we will have to pull the data. Yeah, we're going to have to connect. And down at the bottom, obviously, we'll disconnect. What else will we have to do to get the data?
You write a SQL command.
Yep.
That selects everything.
So we'll have to write and execute. Okay. We'll connect to the database. We'll fetch out all of the information in our beers table, and we'll store it in some kind of variable or array in memory.
Format it, you know? Format it in a certain way that.
Right. So what format? That's right. So when we select it, normally we have it in a PHP array, which typically we call beers on our beers.php. So what will we have to do with that? What format do we need for our API? Right, so we're going to have to convert the PHP array to JSON. Yep. Which we do, there's only one, we only need one line of code for that. There's a built-in function in PHP. We did the reverse last week, right? When we got from Google with reCAPTCHA, they gave us JSON and we had to convert it from JSON into a PHP array. So we're going to do the reverse today. And then what's the last thing we need to do once we have all this data is in JSON? Yeah, we have to render it. So render all the JSON. That's it. So the only really thing that we haven't done is that, but that's just going to be the inverse of what we did last week, where we had JSON and we were converting it. So let's connect. Now, notice what folder we're in here. We're inside of the API folder. Where is our db.php? It's in the root. So how do we go back one folder, up one level? So if we prefix it with ... / that takes us out of the API folder up one level in the directory tree. Right? If we don't do that, we're going to get an error trying to require the file. Our disconnect will be the same as always. The code in this section for writing and running the query, that's be exactly the same 3 or 4 lines of code we have on beers.php on our actual HTML version. Our query should be simple. What query do we need to run? Yep. That's it. Get all the rows, all the columns. Right? Our API we're making, and we could choose, right? Maybe there are columns that we have for our own internal purposes. Like maybe we have a cost column, not how much we sell a case of beer for, but how much we buy a case of beer for. We don't want to include that data to somebody's mobile app. So we would make sure to specify, you know, we're going to select the name, domestic, light, and price only, but we're excluding the cost column, because we don't want to make that value available. So when we're building the API, we have full control over our data, right? We can decide what's available and what users can do with it. We'll set up a command. We'll run the query with execute. And then we'll need to store the results in a PHP array using fetch all. These 4 lines are identical. If I open up beers.php in the root, this code is going to be absolutely identical. The only difference is here we did all the searching stuff. Prepare, execute, fetch. We just did it this way because we had our dynamic search parameters. We'll just keep it simple for now. So now we have this. If I run the page right now, it should just be blank. If I don't get an error, it means my code is okay. So I'm going to save my page. Let's upload it, our API folder, to the server. Try running it and just making sure we get a blank screen, that nothing crashed and we don't get an error message. So this page right now, it will connect and get the data. It just doesn't do anything with it. It just stores it in memory and that's it. We're not printing anything out right now. And so there's absolutely nothing new here. So I'm just going to upload So make sure you create the API folder on the server. You could just upload that whole API folder or your whole lesson 13. So my page is blank. That's good. I didn't get any error message, so we can assume that what's on there is probably working so far. So only need 2 more lines here. We need to convert this to JSON, and then we need to print out the result. So I'll create a JSON on a variable called JSON OBJ for JSON object. So last week we used, if I start typing JSON, last week we used the JSON decode function, right? Google sent us JSON. We used JSON decode to convert it into a PHP array. Today we're doing the opposite. We have a PHP array called beers. We need to convert that into JSON. So which function should be fairly evident are we going to call? Jacob? Yeah, we're going to call JSON encode. And it takes couple of parameters, but the only required one is, okay, what's the PHP array we're converting to JSON? So we're converting our beers object to JSON. So we don't have to build the JSON manually. JSON encode will do it for us. I know you guys, you started a couple weeks ago talking about and working with JSON in Tom's class. This is one of the reasons it's so easy for when we're writing code in JavaScript, it's so easy for us to work with APIs because JSON is JavaScript, right? So it's very easy if we're working in JavaScript to make calls to get or send data to and from APIs because it's all using the same language. So the last thing we need to do, I think ASAT, you said it, was we would need to then just echo out the JSON that we get back. Take our PHP array, convert it to JSON, and print out the JSON that we get. This should, I'll upload in a minute. When we reload the page, upload and refresh, we should now get all of the data in the beers table in JSON format. So I'll re-upload. So there's a JSON representation, and it includes, it's right up to date. It includes the beer I just added.
There's a code redundancy that JSON. It also adds the name and the field, like beer ID is 1 and the 0 is 1. So can we discard that code?
I think if we play around with it, yes, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's giving it to us twice. It's repeating. Let's play around with the options. The other thing we can check first, there's also a useful site out there whenever we're trying to work with JSON. There's a site that will validate your JSON or your JavaScript called JSLint. I don't know if anyone's ever used this. When you're trying to write JavaScript or JSON, if you put it in here, it will tell you whether it's valid. So I'll just paste that in and hit the JSLint button. And it says our JSON is all good.
Does this work with jQuery as well?
Good question. Does it work with jQuery? I don't know. Try it, Rob. Take something you've got from one of Tom's lessons, go to jslint.com and throw it in. I think so, but I'm not entirely sure. Let's just see, there may be a... I'm not sure. Try it out and let me know if it works. Just have run like a simple document.ready on there. So ASAT, in answer to your question, there are some other options here. I haven't really played around with them. So by default, it's saying 0 as the second parameter. I'm not sure what happens if we try 1. And maybe we have to check the JSON encode documentation. I'll see if I add in a 1 here, what that changes in our output. Nothing. Okay, let's check that out. I'll have to do a little more looking. I see what you mean, how we have everything repeated. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure. There should be a way to prevent that. It may also have to do with the way we're fetching the results here. It might have to do with how those options are set. So rather than changing it here, we'd have to provide the style here. Have to experiment a little bit. It may have to do with the format of our PHP array. Yeah, we could. There should be a more efficient way because this list, there may be a ton of data, right? There's only 5 or 6 records here. This could be thousands and thousands of records. So to have to copy them manually, it's workable. It's probably not, but it might be very slow. So it's a very good question you raise. I'll see if there's maybe a way to clean it up and I can post it on Blackboard. I'll think about it. So once we have this available, then we just need to give, if we want this information to be public, I mean, there's basically different access levels with APIs. Right now, this API is public, right? Any application, as long as they have the URL, they can call our URL and they can get our data in JSON. So some APIs are public. They don't require, like anybody can use them anonymously. Others require some kind of authentication, right? With Google required us to authenticate ourselves before we used reCAPTCHA. How did Google? Yeah, right? We had to go to Google and we had to sign up with reCAPTCHA. We had to register our domain and create the site and secret keys. So when we call the API, we would have to pass those keys in and Google would validate if we provided a valid key or not. So many times we are going to make our data available, but we're going to control access to it. Other times we're just going to make it public. Let's do one other thing with this. Right now, this shows all the beers. Let's change it so that if I make the API call like this, what should happen in this case? So my little mobile app makes a call, consumes our API, but notice the URL. What should I get back in this case? Sorry? Yeah, I should just get back that one record rather than all the records. It should match based on the name. So we could create this in a completely separate API page, but we could probably do it right in this one. We could just put in an if statement. If we have a beer name in the URL, we'll add a where clause onto our query and only get that one beer. So for example, I didn't finish writing the code because it was midnight last night when I had this brainwave to go ahead and build this little Node.js app. So the idea would be this page calls the API that gets all the beers, but if I click details, it might take me to the next screen in my mobile app. It would call the same API, but it would pass in that name. And then I could display all of the details as well as my own data about that beer, like comments and ratings, for example. So what would we do on this page so that if we have a name, beer name, passed in the URL, our API will only return that one record. And if we have no beer name, we'll return all the records.
Let's change select query.
Yep, okay. So what should we check? You're right.
We have to check the query string.
You got it. So if our URL contains a query string key called name, and we'll just append on actually, I guess we can create a variable here called name equals get name. We might have a name value in the URL and we might not. But if we do, let's stick it in a variable and let's add a where clause onto our SQL. So we're no longer getting all the beers, we're only getting one. And we'll use equals, we'll make it an exact match. It's not a like where we could have, you know, like a user could put in Sleeman and get 5 different beers made by Sleeman. It's got to be an exact match on the name. So we'd also need to do something here, right? So we'll change our SQL, and what will we need to do before we execute the query? Yeah, we'll have to bind the parameter. So now we can say, so if our name variable from line 9 isn't and I'll just, well, I'm not running it locally today, so it doesn't matter. It should work fine. So if we have a name passed in, let's build a where clause and inject that name into our where clause. So now instead of getting all the beers, we're just going to get one, which we might use on like a detail screen. I will put the code back up. Just want to check if we did it right. So if I do it this way, I pass in steam whistle, I get just that one. Can try different names. Oops. Trying to remember what other beers are in my. But when it finds a match, I get that one record back. If there's no match, I get an empty array coming back. So we just added, line 13 was already here, but we added the little if statements above and below line 13. So our API is really all about sharing, right? We have our database. We want to give a small amount of access to other people. In this case, we've done it publicly, but we could set it up with keys if we wanted to control who had access. And it could be like Google. Keys can work 2 ways. With Google, anybody can get a key, right? You just go to Google and you create it and you can use the API. It may be a case, so Chad, I'm going to come back to your scenario, right? So I'm the main beer store, but I want anybody who sells any affiliates to have it. So doesn't mean, you know, if Omar's in a different business, he can't come in and just get a key and get access to my data, right? He has to be authorized. So in that case, if you run the beer store, you will create the keys for your sub stores and your sub businesses and go, here's your access token, here's your key. Right, or you would set them up and email them out, and you would store the keys in your database, and they would have to provide a valid key. So when they called the API, their API call would have to look something like this, for example. You know, common term is called, you know, access token equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that would be a number that, you know, Chad, you as the business owner would generate and store in your database, and you would give out a separate key to each authorized user. And if they didn't provide a valid token, and that would be an encrypted number, then they wouldn't be able to get the data, right? So that's how we would control access. So whenever we're thinking of sharing, someone needs access to our data, the immediate solution that should come to mind is we need to build an API. Right? We talked last week about an e-commerce scenario where we get orders in one site and other companies need access to that data. Or we have products in one site and we need to make those products available in our store. Let's not copy or re-enter manually 2 copies of the same data. Let's just build an API so we can share whatever needs to be shared.
To make it private, we have to add an extra command into our beers PHP.
Okay, well, let's say I want to make it private. So let's say with an access token, right? Either one you signed up for or one the administrator granted you. So here's how you'd have to call the API. It would look something like that. So in here, the first thing I would have to do, I'll just kind of give you an idea and write the code, and it would look something like this. So the first thing would be to say, be something like this. Right? So I'd read the access token that was in your request, that you included in the request. Then I'd go to the database and say, I would check whether that access token existed in the database, yes or no. And I would do a count. Are there any clients with that access token? If not, I'd send back an unauthorized message, right? And if it was found, then I would continue on and send you back the JSON. So that's how we could easily control the access. Make sense? One of the other ways we could do it is like on our register page, when new users signed up, if we automatically wanted to give any users of the site an access token, when we saved a new user, we could add an access token field here, and we could write an encryption like a generator to generate a random access token. And when we saved a new user, we could put that in and email you out, here's your access token for accessing our API. So if you want to access our API, include this in any calls you make to our API. So that'd be one way, another way of managing it. But this would be, we'd have to check here somehow.
They would put that into the browser, the access code?
Well, see, normally the APIs aren't called through the browser, right? I'll show you how it's done here, and I realize we need to take a break. So my little app here, right? As soon as this page loads, here's what it does. Here's some Node.js code for you. Here's the front end. This is the HTML, and this is using AngularJS. So here's the HTML with Bootstrap. It probably looks fairly familiar. And what it does is it uses this AngularJS file called my beer controller, and there's a function in here called getBeers that says when the body is initialized, go ahead and call our getBeers function. So this is AngularJS code I was just writing. We were just doing this lesson a couple weeks ago with the students in second year. So we'll do this next year. So it calls getBeers, and here's the code. Just close it. I have a getBeers, so I set up the URL. There's the URL I want to call. And this is basically jQuery, right? Use HTTP to call a get. So it calls this URL. It's like using curl. It's basically like we used curl last week to call the Google API. This is kind of the Angular and JavaScript equivalent of using curl. We use an HTTP or an AJAX get to any URL, and then we get back all of the data. I put it in an Angular object called beers, and I pass it back to my page, and this is an Angular loop. Really simple. Simple then for each. It's an ng repeat, an Angular repeat. So repeat through the list of beers and output a new list item tag. So this application can now call my API that way. If I had an access token, I would need to include it here, right? Or I wanted a specific beer, I'd need to include it on the end. That's it. So this is how I would do it with Node.js and Angular, but it could be we could build it in anything. You could build an ASP.NET site, you could build an iPhone app, you could build an Android app. any application that can call that URL and can read JSON has access to that data to display it, format it however they want. I got this idea at about 11:30 last night. We'll see how long it takes me. I gave myself an hour. If I could do it in an hour, I would build it. But that's what it, so that's what it may look like. And it's real time. If I go back and delete something here, if I delete and refresh, right, it just calls my API again, and it's always going to be live. Real time.
Can you pick and choose what the API can see with the SQL query, so which columns, if you don't want to display?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I only wanted, so we would control that. Here, I'll let you answer your own question, Robert. How would we do it? Right. So if I only wanted the name and price, that means any client that consumes the API, they'll only have those two values. They won't have, right? Let's say, in fact, I'll try it. Let's say I take out name. My API is going to look for a field called name, because here's my API. Here's the code in the front end. I'm using Angular, beer.name. If that column doesn't exist in the API, watch what happens when I modify it. So if we go to our API now and refresh, right? Right now, all I have is prices. If I refresh my little app, right? We have full control as the API developer. Our API might also allow users to modify data or add new records. That's up to you as the API developer. Are we going to allow them to add data to our database or change or delete? Or are we just going to let them see it, and what can they see? Totally your control. So we don't have to make everything available. We only make available the things we want to. But it's a window, basically they don't get direct access to our data. We're giving them a controlled some other application, a controlled window. So they can see, or they can only see the pieces of it that we allow them to, and nothing else. Right? As soon as I put it back, it's there.
So you can, in essence, show the users inside database without the password.
Absolutely. Or if this is e-commerce, if we're selling product, if we're selling things, right, our suppliers need to know who the customers are and what products they bought and what their addresses are, so the suppliers could make and ship them. But we're not going to make available, the totals of their orders. Our supplier doesn't need to see how much we charge the customer, or we're not going to share their credit card information, even though maybe we have that. We're only going to give the pieces that they need. This might even be done in steps, right? We might have a free version and a paid version. That's the way a lot of apps work. We'll make a little bit of the data available free. We'll make more of the data available for a fee, right? Maybe we'll let you look at the beer listings here, but if you want the details, you got to pay for that. So it depends whether you have the free or the pro version of our app or our API.
It'll just call different SQL queries depending on what credentials are tied in.
Yep, that's right. So it's all about sharing data, and JSON's the big thing we need to know, right? Once you understand what an API is and how it works, so long as what we're building can read and write JSON, we can use it to consume APIs and to build our own APIs. So we'll do this. We'll kind of do this end of it with Node.js and Angular right around this time next year, next March and April, and we'll build this stuff together. Okay, sorry I went on far too long. So let's take a longer break. Why don't we just take